Everyone, if there was a little pause there, I was just waiting for the timer to start counting. I want to talk about the issue of sensitivity readers in the world of literature. I came across this is actually from an article I read this morning in The Guardian online. Not my paper of choice by any means, but it was The Guardian that was reporting this, somewhat surprisingly, because you'd think they'd be all for it. But they were quoting the successful writer Ian McEwan. And I'll read out a little bit. It's now got not the paywall. The Guardian doesn't have that, but after reading a certain amount, they sort of fade it out, and then you need to subscribe. I'll put this in the link in the video, and you should be able to open it because you can look at it once or twice, but do read it in one sitting. Otherwise, when you reopen it again, it's kind of faded out. So that's the only thing I would say. But I can read out the first bit. Ian McEwan criticises hiring of sensitivity readers looking for offensive material in manuscripts. Booker-winning novelist describes the process of screening out things that might offend readers as mass hysterias and moral panics that sweep through populations every now and then. And he also said, I remember reading this morning, that his advice to young people was basically to hell with them regarding his fear of offence. And he cited a case of young men, for example, who may be reluctant to talk about passion, romantic passion, in case it offends half the population. There was a lot of other poignant points he raised, but like I say, it's not been faded out. But if you look at the link, you should be able to read it. I'm a fan of him. I've got quite a number of his books. I'm reading this at the moment, Saturday. It's a BP talk. Very, very broadly speaking, it's about a neurosurgeon who's kind of pondering his own life and the world in the lead up to the invasion of Iraq in 2003. So it sort of set Saturday in question is actually the 15th of February 2003 with that huge anti-war protest. McEwan's one of those writers not everyone appreciates. Some find his prose a little bit complex, even I do at times. But broadly speaking, I like his work, and I've got at least 6 or 7 of his novels. Enduring Love was one of several of his works that were adapted to film, and that was a film starring Daniel Craig and Samantha Morton before Craig became Bond, about a man who deals with a stalker in the aftermath of a balloon accident, hot air balloon accident. Anyway, this isn't really to pitch for Ian McEwan as a writer. It's more to address the issues he's raising. I think he's absolutely right. So what are sensitivity readers? If you haven't heard of this before, broadly speaking, and I don't know all the details of this, but I don't like what I do know. Basically, some publishing houses are now getting into this practice of hiring sensitivity readers. These are people who may come from a certain community, and their job basically is to analyze the draft to see if there's anything that may cause offence. Now, this is kind of glossed up as helpful advice, as just another part of the editing process. I personally think there's something rather sinister about it, something rather Orwellian, like almost like in a totalitarian state where you would have state censors look through a director's work or a writer's work for that matter. I just have a very uneasy feeling about it, no matter how it's presented. As it stands, it's not mandated, so writers aren't forced to take on sensitivity readers. But here's the problem. If this is increasingly used, publishing houses may well start imposing it. And, when this was reported in The Guardian, even in The Guardian, most people were against it, saying, oh, it takes away creative freedom, which it absolutely does. I mean, people might say, oh, but it's just helpful advice. Whatever way you gloss it over, it's an interference in the writer's creative process. Now, a final draft may well be edited anyway by the publishing house. That's just part and parcel. It's always been that way. But, writers sort of go in with that understanding. And, it's very, very, very hard to get published. Very hard. So to me, this is just adding more barriers. It's just making it even harder. And, for someone who has been successful, for Ian McEwan, he's kind of lucky because he was writing at a time when that didn't exist. He's now 75. He's already successful. I think the problem here for young writers or new writers, I shouldn't just say young, someone can start writing when they're 50 or 60. For new writers who wish to get published, I mean, it's all very well people saying this is not censorship, but if writers are in a situation where they don't take on the advice, what's to say that sensitivity reader won't go and report back to the publishing house? Because, I mean, what is their job exactly? Is it a volunteer position? Are they being paid for it? I think there's a lot of questions about this. Um, and then if the publishing house takes issue with the fact the writer has decided to ignore their advice, then he or she may find themselves not getting published because it doesn't go into our um, what we're looking for as a publishing house. But a good publishing house should have as much plurality of opinion as possible. I mean, big ones. Maybe you may have more smaller ones that are for a very niche market, but big publishing houses should be as a broader church as possible in a sense of allowing conservative viewpoints, left wing viewpoints, pictures. Because if you're in a situation where you're only publishing one worldview, then you may as well be a political party. Um, I do feel that way, and this has sometimes been a question aimed at um, big news agents. Excuse me, not news agents, big um, book agents like Waterstones. I I don't really have any basis to say this is a fact, but I have seen, for example, Waterstones promote blatantly woke, very left wing publications and have it as a book of the week or whatever. Um, is there a bias in the publishing industry against, the anti woke? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. I mean, I bought Douglas Murray's The Madness of Crowds and Waterstones, so he's very critical of all that stuff. But to delve a bit more into this notion of the very notion of sensitivity readers, firstly, the sensitivity readers themselves, what gives them a monopoly on what is and isn't offensive? Because you could take, for example, um, a black person, a gay person, an Asian person, and they may be the sensitivity reader because you may have a white writer or a straight writer, and supposedly their job is to give friendly advice and say, oh, but this wouldn't happen or that might be offensive. Now, it may, the sensitivity reader themselves may have good intentions, although I personally would question someone's motivation in wanting to do a job like that, honestly. But, you know, what they may consider offensive doesn't necessarily mean the whole community would. I mean, I think we need to be a little bit wary of this idea of this person is the representative of a whole community. I mean, I certainly wouldn't claim to be a representative of white straight men. Um, so I don't think anyone could claim to be a representative of the whole community in that sense. So who gets to decide what's offensive? That's a question. Um, and it doesn't matter that it's not mandated or the writer isn't obliged to take the advice. If you're in a creative process, often writers want to be secluded. They want their head clear. How can they do that when there's someone kind of peering over their back and say, "Oh, you can't say that"? As McEwan pointed out, writing's always been provocative, and arguably it should be. I mean, if we get rid of any literature that's ever been offensive, it would be such a sanitized and boring world of literature. A lot of great works have caused offence at some point or another. Now, obviously, if you have someone who really is racist, they're promoting white supremacist views or something, or they are being openly misogynistic, misandry, I won't even mention because it gets a free pass anyway. It's fine to be misandric. But if they're being openly misogynistic, they're not going to get published anyway. This is the thing. I mean, I just don't see a need for sensitivity readers because if someone is being overtly, deliberately offensive, most publishing houses will turn them down anyway. But this micro sensitivity of trying to, analyze each little nuance. So that might be offensive. That's triggering. I really have a problem with it. Um, what else can be said? I mean, yeah, I lost my trail of thought, but it's more than annoying. Actually, I think it's a little bit sinister. Um, I'm an aspiring writer. I've written a few short stories. I've kind of went on a long hiatus. I haven't done it for quite a while now, a couple of years, partly because my print was broken. Also, I've had distractions, but I hope one day to get published. And I do not want this compromise of, well, Nathan, you could get published, but because you have characters who are from minority groups, or otherwise, you need to take on a sensitivity reader to be published. I'd be very uneasy about that. I'd be thinking, well, wait a second. I'm trying to do this creative process. I'm trying to, make a story here, and there's someone leaning over my back, literally, or metaphorically, I should say. But it would feel like that. It would feel like someone is leaning over your back. Now, the caveat here is a good writer, a responsible writer, of course, should do his or her research. If, for example, use myself for example, I'm a white guy. If I'm writing about another culture, of course I should do my research, and I should try and get things accurate. Otherwise, it would polarize readers. I've personally read books where I'm looking at stuff and I think that's wrong. That isn't accurate about this situation, and it's irritating. But I'm not going to demand the writer be censored or cancelled. Um, And there really are books that get a free pass that really are quite offensive. I mean, I would argue Remy Edo Lodge's "Why I No Longer Talk to White People" is grossly offensive. But she was never subjected to sensitivity readers because minority racists, frankly, get a free pass to be racist, and they're enabled by white woke idiots. Sorry to be blunt about it, but that's this subject. When we're getting into issues of freedom of expression, it's very, very important. And they will say, it's not an attack on free expression, it's just a bit of guidelines. Okay, it's not mandated at the moment. But like I say, all it takes is publishing houses to increasing the uses practice, then effectively it is censorship by stealth. Because what you're doing is saying that if a writer doesn't take on the advice, they are not going to get published. That's censorship because it's depriving them of the opportunity to have their work read, and to make a living out of it, which very few writers do, only the most successful. But like I said, a good writer should do research. If I'm talking about, say, the experiences of a young Chinese woman in Mao's China, I would have to do research. You'd have to look at interviews. It may not be practically possible to do interviews, but at the very least, I should try and get some background. Uh, I have a pretty good knowledge of history, so I already have some background, but I wouldn't be so arrogant to assume I know everything. I remember I had a character who was a doctor. Now, I know nothing about the medical world, or very little in terms of, their daily processes. So I'd have to research that. Is this a normal procedure that a doctor would do, and so on. And one thing about Ian McEwan, he really does his research. He does his homework. That's why I think he is an authority to speak on this, because he does his homework. Um, I'm gonna wrap this up soon. I know I always say that and I talk for minutes afterwards, but I really will. A good writer should, of course, do research. Absolutely. That just it makes a book better, and it makes it more likely to get good reviews and not annoy people. Yeah, of course. But to me, the idea of sensitivity readers, having these people who come in and seem to think they have the monopoly on right or wrong, or what is and isn't offensive. Just there's something that doesn't sit well with me. And as for people who think a work might be offensive, don't read it. Don't read it, or even criticize it. You've got the freedom of speech to criticize it, but demanding that it be sanitized and watered down to please people's feelings. It's just honestly, then you would have a situation where so many philosophical, profound questions are just dismissed because they might offend someone. It's utterly pathetic, and I think Ian McEwan is absolutely right. And I'm sure he's not the only best-selling writer who has a problem with it. I hope others speak up as well, because it's it doesn't sit well with me. I just quickly quote or cite the late Martin Amis, who wrote on the differences between Islam and Islamism, and he was very vocal about the latter. Now, there will be Muslims who will just be triggered, some Muslims who just get triggered by the very mention of the word Islamism. So, should the late Martin Amis have been censored for that, or been required to water it down? Because really, watering something down is just another form of censorship. It's wrong. If you have a writer who's just coming out with hateful bile, Mein Kampf style, then, in today's world, they're very, very unlikely to be published anyway. So I just don't see a need for sensitivity readers. And I think there's something rather sinister about it. Let me know your thoughts, particularly if you've done any writing, or what you think of it if you yourself are an aspiring writer. I have a big problem with it. And it may not be mandated, but I don't think it should be encouraged. I don't think it's a good thing, whatever intentions are there. If you're writing about another group, do research, talk to people, fine. But that should be the choice of the writer. It shouldn't be something that's sort of coerced in or pressured. They're pressured into.